An incoming army of 600 plus chariots are quickly approaching, an army that has just experienced the death of their firstborn sons. They are headed straight for those who would have been seen as those to blame. A large nation of 2 million plus men, but also women and children, and this nation is beyond scared. So scared that they turn on their leader. The leader in the midst of this chaos, a powerful army nearing, those he's leading are turning on him so quickly. This leader stays calm, cool, and collected. In the midst of this chaos, and not only calm, cool, and collected, but he looks to the only one who could help. So we have Egypt headed straight for Israel, and Moses calling the Israelites to observe the Lord who fights for them. So that's kind of just a recap. If you weren't with us last week, we are dealing with the second half of chapter 14, a familiar text. But dealing with the second half tonight, and this evening we get to see on full display the Lord who fights for Israel. And I believe I don't have this text on, but our passage last week ended with Moses saying in Exodus 14:14, "The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. So coming out of our study last week, you have to wonder, what were the Israelites thinking? Okay, they were doubting, they weren't trusting the Lord, they were scared out of their minds. And then Moses says, the Lord will fight for you, you have only to be silent. You have to wonder what the Israelites were thinking. How did they expect God to fight for them? What would they have expected God to do when Moses said this? Well, tonight we get to actually find out what God would do as he fights for Israel. And as I said, a familiar text, many of us know this story of the Red Sea very well. So this evening we're going to dig into these verses that speak of it. We're going to look at what exactly happened in the midst of that sea. How was the battle fought by the Lord? What did he exactly do for Israel? So our theme for this evening of Exodus 14:15 through 31 is this: the Lord's name is magnified as he fights for Israel in the midst of the Red Sea. As we consider the purposes of the Lord, so again, as we're kind of just starting this study of these verses, I'd ask you to maybe answer this question in your own mind as we begin, and that is, why did God divide the Red Sea? Okay, why did God divide the Red Sea? Why did he separate the water? So a familiar story, so get an answer in your mind. Why did God divide the Red Sea? Your answer might even seem simple, but have it in your mind. Why did God divide the Red Sea? We might say to save Israel. To save Israel. And I would say that is not the main or the first and foremost reason why he divided the Red Sea. Certainly that was an outcome. Certainly they were saved. But there's something greater going on in these verses. We're going to see that tonight in our study. So we begin with divine battle plans, and this comes in verses 15 and 18, and it begins with preparing for battle. God tells Israel to move forward toward the sea. If you look with me at Exodus 14:15, it says, the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward." So as we consider what God says at first here to Moses, this seems odd. Okay, again, going off of the words that I even just quoted for us from Moses right before verse 15, this seems odd for God to say this to Moses, as Moses is the one who has pointed them to God. We might question, did Moses then turn around? So he points the people to God, and then he turns around and cries out to God in hopelessness. Okay, I believe here this is God speaking through Moses. He's heard the cry of the Israelites, and now God is giving Moses directives for the Israelites. So he's not directly confronting Moses' own thoughts or Moses' doubts. I don't believe Moses has these at this point, going off of his words from last week. But God questions the Israelites here through Moses, the one who would communicate his word to them. Why do you cry to me? It's a question to the Israelites. And he says, why do you cry to me? Showing that there's no reason to do so. No reason to be scared or worried, as he is about to work. What they need to do is not cry, but move forward, as our as verse 15 says in the latter half, tell the people of Israel to go forward. Which remember, and as I show here in the point, remember where they are. They're on the beach. They're on a beach. Moving forward means moving into the sea. And that's exactly what God has in mind, though the Israelites don't know this yet. Continue on with these battle plans. God calls his commander to action, as he says in verse 16, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. So this is where in the story we find how God will deliver Israel. Up to this point, it hasn't been made clear how he's going to actually deliver or save Israel. But Moses stands here from these words that God gives him. He stands here in the place that he and Aaron have stood many times before in the plague. Just one such example, Exodus 7:20, the first plague. It says, Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants. He lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood. So this use of this staff is not a new thing. This is something that's been used many, many times. But Moses lifting up his staff, we're going to see, is a symbolic act. And then in God's words to Moses, here we find these battle plans are not just plans, but they communicate what will happen. If you look with me at verses 17 and 18. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So if you think about battle plans, okay, think about a military leader. They can lay out, they can draw up battle plans. They can feel extremely confident in those plans. They can believe we're going to be victorious. But ultimately, if that military leader is honest with themselves, they cannot say this with certainty. God does here. They will be victorious. At this point, how exactly this victory will be manifested isn't shown, but it's going to be shown soon. And one more thing I want us to consider here, and we begin to consider this question of purpose that I started with in the beginning. If you look back, and we'll start at verse 16. Thinking about purpose, okay? God's words to Moses. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So God wants the sea divided for Israel to walk through it, but also that he may get glory, which means to honor, or means honor over Pharaoh, and also that the Egyptians should know that he is the Lord. So breaking open the Red Sea is not only, or even I'd go so far as to say mainly, for the salvation of the Israelites, but there's more to it. Okay, and we start to get that idea as we consider these verses. And we're going to consider this more fully on our way, and then especially at the end. But we move on, we get battle plans, and now continuing to consider this battle, we see the divine guard. Okay, the stress of these next two verses is the protective barrier that God was for Israel from the Egyptians. So as you're picturing this in your mind, okay, it's a story. Egypt is barreling right towards the Israelites. They're headed for a collision course for Israel, and God stands as their shield. As we see God in the pillar moved from in front of Israel to behind Israel. We get this from verse 19 and a little bit into verse 20. It says, then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. So we're told in verse 19 that the angel of God, okay, the angel of God who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind him. So rather being in front, moves behind. And then, as you follow along in verse 19, it goes on to say that the pillar of cloud moved from before them and then stood behind them. And we might question as you're reading along, are these two separate things, okay, that were in front of Israel and then now are moving behind Israel. And as we think about this question, to answer it, I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe there's two separate things here, but this is talking about one and the same entity. Okay, we've already been told in Exodus 13:21, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud. Okay, so the Lord was in pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. The Lord and this pillar are one. Okay, this is God manifesting himself to Israel, leading Israel. But we've also seen this idea, okay, specifically thinking about the angel of the Lord. That's what our text says right in the beginning there. Then the angel of the Lord. Okay, who is the angel of the Lord? Is this actually God? Well, we've already seen this in Exodus 3:2-6, back with the burning bush. I believe it's quite clear that the angel of the Lord is God showing up to Moses in the burning bush. Exodus 3:2-6 says, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. So kind of same idea here. God said to be in the pillar. The angel of the Lord here in Exodus 3:2 is in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. And it goes on and says in verse 2, he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, and yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. So I'd stress that here. We start with the angel of the Lord. As it says, it appeared to him in the flame of fire. Now we're told that God called to him out of the midst of the bush. I believe it's showing this angel of the Lord is God. And he goes on to say, Moses, and he said, here I am. And then verse 5 continues, then he said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So the angel of the Lord is none other than God himself, as it speaks of the angel of the Lord appearing in the fire, and then it speaks of God calling out of the midst of the bush, and even here at the end, Moses being afraid to look at God. So the text itself equates the angel of the Lord and God. So in our text, when it says the angel of the Lord, it is referring to God. Also thinking about the burning bush. Okay, in the burning bush, we have a self-existent flame. We're told that the flame is there, but the bush was not consumed. So this fire did not need the bush to fuel it, to cause it as a fire. We have the same thing going on in the pillar of fire. It seems that this is, again, a self-existent fire. God showing up in fire, fire that needs nothing to remain. So from these things, I don't believe we're to see that the angel of the Lord and this pillar are separate things, but they're one and the same in our text. And it may very well be presented to us in this way to stress. That's what I think these verses are stressing, but it might be presented to us, the angel of the Lord and then the pillar, to stress that God is the one who's guarding Israel. So again, as you're thinking about the story, the picture here now, Egypt's barreling toward Israel, and God comes in the pillar of cloud to separate them from Israel, and then on the other side of Israel is the Red Sea. So you have the Egyptian army, then you have God in this pillar, then you have Israel, then you have the Red Sea, all lined up in a row there. Verse 20 says something else at the end. Okay, we find God separating Egypt from Israel the whole night, as it says in verse 20, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And then it says, and there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. So as we think about these words, this is a difficult verse to interpret. Okay, it's not extremely clear even in the original text, but some take this verse to mean, you may have even seen pictures or movies presenting it this way. Some take this verse to mean that there was pitch darkness for Egypt and then light for Israel. Okay, that the Egyptians couldn't see, the Israelites could see. But the text doesn't come out to say this clearly at all. What is definitely clear here, and I believe the ultimate point that we should take from it is that that of the separation that God brought about, that he stepped in between Egypt and Israel, what we just saw in verse 19, to protect Israel from Egypt. Just like you might think about a fight, just like someone steps in between two people who maybe are about to fight, God steps in and he stands as guard for the Israelites. So the pillar of cloud and fire went from a leading posture to a protective posture. And just thinking about the text that we looked at two studies ago in our study of Exodus, just going through what we've seen as we think about this pillar of cloud and fire, it originally symbolized God's leading, as it says in Exodus 13:21, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire. It also was God's provision in giving light at night. As it continues on, it says, and the Lord went before them by day in the pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. This pillar was also God's presence. As it says at the end in verse 22, it says, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. So it's shown God's, or it's symbolized God's leading. It's symbolized God's provision or provided for them, and then it's his presence. And now we get this new dynamic, and it's his protection. God's protecting his people. So the pillar shows different sides of what God is doing in his relationship to Israel in several different ways. So God stands between Israel and their enemies. He puts himself between them. And next, ramping up to this battle, we get a divine battlefield is paved from verses 21 and 23. And it begins with God paves a path through the sea. As it says in verse 21, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. So God had commanded Moses to lift up his staff and stretch his hand and divide the Red Sea back in verse 16. And here Moses does this, and we ultimately find out that this is nothing Moses is doing, but it was the power of God, as it says here, and the Lord drove the sea back. God breaks open this sea. Moses stood as the visible symbol of God's power, but it was ultimately God's power that pushed the water to either side so that there was a path of dry land going through the Red Sea. So once again, we see the Creator God. Okay, we saw him in the plagues, and now we see it once again here that God is the Creator. He is the controller. He is the sustainer of all creation. Here with the dividing of the Red Sea, he's doing something out of the ordinary. Okay, what had been done in creation. In Genesis 1, 9 through 10, it says, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So God here reverses what we had seen in creation with the waters and the lands being separated. He reverses this here in this miracle of the dividing of the Red Sea. We find that this path is for the Israelites to walk through the sea, as it says in verse 22. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Okay, it's helpful at this point to just sit back and just try to envision this. Okay, try to picture what this text is presenting. Okay, what a scene for the Israelites. Can you just imagine being there? Okay, to see the sea dividing for one, and then to be in the midst of it. Okay, so it's one to see this going down, but then to actually be in the middle of it, to have water on your right and on your left, to be standing on dry ground with water on side to side, but it's a wall. Okay, it's not coming down over you, but it is a wall. It's presented here. It's staying straight up and down. And as you picture this, maybe the closest thing, and it doesn't even come close, is you can picture if you've ever been to an aquarium, okay, one with a large glass tank with fish in it, okay, that goes straight up and down. The water is held back. You can see the water. You can see the fish, but there's no glass here in our text, okay? There's no glass holding up the water. It is just the wind that God sent to drive this water back and continued to drive it back for Israel. Okay, so Israel, they made their way through this sea. And then the next statement in the text, I don't know if we'd expect it. Okay, I don't know if we'd expect, if we didn't know this story before, I don't know if we'd expect this next part, and that is the path is also for the Egyptians. Look with me at verse 23. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them in the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. So if you think about this story, we have not been told that the Israelites knew this was coming. Okay, we don't know if they were aware of the Egyptians coming at this point or if they were oblivious to it. But we're given the big picture view, even if we don't know if the Israelites know, but we're given the big picture view that the Egyptians are let in. Okay, and we may wonder at this point, what is God doing? Okay, just close off this sea, let the Israelites go, stay in guard of them, let the Israelites go through, close off the sea, and then there you go, there's our division. Okay, Israel's safe, the Egyptians can go back to their land, they're protected. But this brings us back to the purpose. Okay, that purpose that I started talking about, we've seen some of it, but the purpose for which God divides the Red Sea, I think we begin to see very much so what his purpose is. It hints to us that purpose, and as we think about that purpose, just think about this from the Egyptians' perspective. Okay, all of a sudden, before your eyes, the sea is opened up. Okay, from side to side, the sea parts. Israel begins to make their way into it, walking between the water, and the water doesn't crash back down, but in your mind, the water could crash down any moment on the Israelites. And as we think about this, God must have pulled away from the Egyptians so they could get past when this verse takes place. And if I was the Egyptians, so I don't know about you, but if I was the Egyptians, I feel as if there would be no way I'm stepping into this sea. No way I'm stepping into this sea. Who knows if this water will now come back down onto us as the army? How was this being suspended in place in the first place? But no, we're told that the Egyptians, they pursued them into the sea. Okay, remember what verse 17 said. God speaking to Moses, and I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they go in after them. God hardened their hearts. He let them go with their evil desires. All discretion is out the window for the Egyptians so that they would pursue their selfish desires of getting the Israelites. So we see how sin can work. All restraint, all insight, all wisdom is left in the dust to pursue one's desires. The Egyptians are a picture of this here. So God has yet to do battle with Egypt. He's planned, he's protected, he's given an escape route for Israel, for his people to flee from battle to get out of safety, but now we find the divine attack. And this comes in verses 24 and 29, and we'll begin with the attack. Starts with sabotage. So the Egyptians, they're flying after the Israelites, probably licking their chops as they have them. Okay, the Israelites are theirs now. And we actually first get the reaction to the sabotage in verse 24, if you look with me there. It says, in the morning, watch the Lord in the pillar of fire and of the cloud look down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic. Okay, the word panic is a good translation here. Further, on top of this idea of panicking comes just the idea of being confused. As we think about the Hebrew word that is used here, it's not the same word, but ironically, if you remember last week in verse 3, Pharaoh thought the Israelites were confused. Okay, God reveals this to Moses, and Pharaoh thought the Israelites were confused. He thought they were wandering aimlessly in the wilderness, so he'd pursue them. And now here stands his army confused. There is commotion in his army. They are disturbed in some way. They don't know what is going on, and it causes a stir. And we find what causes this reaction. What causes this reaction is that the wheels are taken off their chariots. It says this we'll start in verse 24. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic. And then verse 25, we get this idea, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. I think the better translation that represents the text is the King James Version. It says this, and you have to deal with some of the Old English. It says, and it came to pass that in the morning watch the Lord looked upon unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians. And then it says, and took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily. They took off their chariot wheels. That is the idea with this Hebrew word here, that their wheels were taken off. They were removed. That God took off their wheels. He removed them is what this word means. The ESV translates it as clogged. I think the better idea here is that they were removed. These wheels were fully taken off, and it says that they drove heavily. Okay, you can understand, or I think we'd imagine, the fact that they drove heavily. Okay, that no longer were these chariots quickly rolling along with ease, with smoothness. But can you imagine rushing into the Red Sea, horses galloping, chariots connected, moving swiftly, and bang, your chariot drops a bit and is dragging along much harder and slower. You look over to the side, and your wheels are gone. Your chariot bottom is scraping along the sea floor. That is the picture here, and no wonder was there confused commotion in the Egyptian army. What in the world is going on? Well, interestingly enough, they knew what was going on. They admit it, as we find at the end of verse 25. If you look with me there, it says, and the Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. What God does causes the Egyptians to understand this was an act of the Lord. What God said would happen, happens. And going back to last week's passage and then earlier in ours, God started with this in the beginning of our passage last week. He said, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. He said this again in our text this week. Verse 18 said, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So we see this comes true right here in the midst of the sea. They know God is behind this. They know who is fighting for Israel. And two related things I want to mention is, first, this is not the first time that the Egyptians admit this. Okay, this isn't all of a sudden this new revelation of the Lord being Israel's God or fighting for them or working for them. This is not the first time they acknowledge the Lord and what he could do as we think about the plagues. Okay, with Pharaoh's priest magicians with the gnat plague. It says this in Exodus 8:19. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. With Pharaoh's servants in the locust plague in Exodus 10:7, it said, then Pharaoh's servants said to him, how long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined? And then with Pharaoh himself, he acknowledges the Lord very much so as if he is a real God. It says in Exodus 9:27 through 28 in the hail plague. Then Pharaoh sent and called Moses and Aaron and said to them, this time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Plead with the Lord, for there has been enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer. So they know this already. This isn't the first time they've admitted such a thing. But the second thing I want to point out as we think about this is that as they did in the plagues, they acknowledge God, they realize his power, and yet they don't turn to him. Okay, if we go back to our text, it says there, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. So they don't surrender, They don't seek to join the Israelites. They don't submit to God, but they try to get as far away as possible. Let us flee. Let us go in the opposite direction. Let us get away from here. They try to get as far away as possible to the end, to their grave. They refuse to bow to God. And I say to their grave, because this is where they go next. As we've seen this sabotage and God's attack, now we see the destruction that God causes as he attacks. So the destruction. God brings the Red Sea back to its normal state. It says in verses 26 and 27, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen.' So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared." So not only is this returning the Red Sea to how it once was, but this act is a destroying act. It would kill the Egyptians, as God makes this clear to Moses as he says that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. Okay, and we see this then in verse 27, but interestingly enough, we see that the Egyptians surely do flee, but into the sea. As it says in verse 27, "So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea." Same word is used as the Egyptians had said they would flee, but we find they end up fleeing into something that surely was not their desire. They flee right into the sea. We see the one who causes them to do so, an action that is attributed to God, and this word that the Lord threw literally means he shook them off into the sea. God causes the Egyptians to fly right into the sea. And this attack ends in defeat for Egypt, and victory for Israel, death for Egypt, and life for Israel. As we see the Egyptian army is totally defeated in verse 28. "The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained." And as we think about the story that we've seen in past weeks, this was foreshadowed twice. Okay, and I pointed at least one of these out to us in Exodus 7, 11 through 12, as before the plagues start, Aaron's staff swallows up the priests, magicians' staves, and now the Red Sea swallows up the army of Egypt. It says, "Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents, and Aaron's staff swallowed up their staves." Foreshadowing at the very beginning, before the plagues start, what's going to come of Egypt. And then also, God had sent the locusts and the locust plague into the Red Sea, and now he throws the Egyptian army into the Red Sea, as it says in Exodus 10:19. "And the Lord turned the wind into a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea. Not a single locust was left in all the country of Egypt." So as we consider such an end for the Egyptians, we must remember their refusal to the end to submit to God with their lives. Okay, as you think about them dying in this way, this was no unfair punishment. To the end, they refused to serve God. And secondly, we need to remember what Egypt had put Israel through in Exodus 1:22. "Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, 'Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live.'" Baby Israelite boys at the very beginning of our study are tossed into the Nile. They were drowned, and here the Egyptian army is drowned in the Red Sea. And then also think about this defeat. What it meant for Israel is that the Israelite nation is brought to safety, as it says in verse 29 of Exodus 14. "But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left." So they walk through the waters safe and sound. And then our text closes with a report of the battle, kind of a summary of what happens in the outcome. It says this in Exodus 14:30 through 31. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So a reversal takes place. If we think about our text last week, how Israel responded, and now what we get this week, remember Moses' words to the Israelites. He says this in verses 13 and 14. And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." They were scared out of their minds, and Moses here calls them to sit back, watch what the Lord would do. Okay? And now in verse 31, it says, Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So Israel did what Moses had commanded them. Watch, see. And the result was that they, rather than fearing their situation, this fear moves to a fear of the Lord, standing in awe of this God and his power. And further, they don't only believe in the Lord, but they also believe in Moses as their leader. Okay, they were turning on him. They were against him. They were griping against him. And it says that they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So the name of God has been made known, and it has been magnified among his own people. Okay, we've also seen in this text that this was done for the Egyptians, that his name was magnified to them. They were fully aware of God, but it's not only to the Israelites and the Egyptians whom the Lord's name is magnified through this event, but skipping to what we'll look at in a few weeks, in Exodus 15, if you can read that text, it says this in Exodus 15, 14, and 16. The peoples have heard, so this is a song being sung after the Red Sea. It says, the peoples have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are still as stone till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased. So we see several nations are mentioned here that in this song are being said that they are fully aware of what goes on, and ultimately they're trembling before or because of the Lord. And we see an instance in which this was known. So this isn't just a song, Moses saying this, but we're shown that as the people of Israel go into the promised land, in Joshua 2, 8 through 11, the story of Rahab, as Israel spying out the promised land, we see that this event is known to other nations. It says in verse 8, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof, talking about Rahab and the spies, and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. And then verse 10, we get it. It says in verse 10, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. So this event of the dividing of the Red Sea, bringing the Israelites through, and the destruction that it brought upon the Egyptians is carried on to other nations as well. God's name is magnified to Israel, to the Egyptians, and to nations beyond through this event. This was the purpose then. As I asked us to consider in the beginning, this was the purpose of the dividing of the Red Sea, that glory and honor would come on the name of God, that his name would be declared through this event, and he stated it right at the beginning. We saw this last week, and I've mentioned this verse this week. Verse 4, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and then this purpose, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. Certainly it was to get Israel to safety, but this could have been done another way. Okay, God could have brought Israel to safety in another way. He didn't need to bring them down to the Red Sea, but he chose to do that so that, and the text says this, so that his name would be honored through this battle at the sea. This text then, where we should stand, this is a text then that we really should stand back in awe of God, giving him the respect that he deserves. And even this should be a text as we think about our study from last week, as we think about Israel, and we even put ourselves in their place. Israel was extremely concerned for their safety. They feared, they were anxious, they were focused entirely on themselves instead of God and his glory. Rather than considering the bigger picture of what God was doing through this, rather than being focused on how God would work and how his name could be honored, they were focused solely on themselves. How easy is it in our fears, in our anxieties, to be focused on ourselves and our well-being only, rather than the glory of God? So considering all we've seen from Exodus 1 to now chapter 14, we find with God, we see we have a God in which pharaohs are no match. We see we have a God in which creation does his bidding. We see we have a God who our doubts and worries are met in. And then we see we have a God who brings salvation for his people. God is glorified. That is the point of the crossing of the Red Sea. God is revered. That is the purpose. This is why the battle at the Red Sea took place, for God's name to be magnified, high and lifted up, and this should be our focus and concern in all of life above all else. This was God's concern. It should be ours too. So our next study in Exodus is actually only going to be taking place in several weeks due to how the schedule fell for this summer, but it's going to be a continuation of this story, but in song form. Okay, we're going to look at chapter 15, and it's a response, the response of Moses and of Israel to the events of the Red Sea. So you're going to have to keep this text in mind as we wait a couple of weeks. But for tonight, we find that the lost battle from the beginning is finally lost. The knockout punch for Pharaoh in Egypt is finally had. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this text where your name is magnified. You are honored and you are glorified by your plans and your purposes, by your work. Lord, this was at the very start what you were driving at. Certainly Israel's safety, certainly their salvation, but Lord, it's your honor and your glory that is first and foremost. And Lord, I pray that from a text such as this would be our concern, that you would reveal areas of our life where our focus is ourselves or even other things rather than you and your glory. Lord, I pray that this would be a text where we would be absolutely amazed at the things you can do, at your attributes, the way in which you worked for Israel and the way in which you continue to work for us today as Christians. And Lord, I pray that you would refresh us and even cause us to reevaluate our lives and this week to keep in our mind even the question, am I seeking, am I focusing on your glory? Lord, I pray that as this is your purpose, your plan for your name to be glorified, I pray that this would be our aim, our goal in everything that we do as we live this week and as we work this week and as we interact with one another this week. Lord, help us to do so. May your name be honored and glorified. And Lord, I also just now pray for our time of fellowship as well. Pray that you would use it within the life of our church just to be able to talk with one another, get to know one another better, encourage one another, just lift up one another, and even, Lord, to use it to talk about the way in which you are working in our lives and even the way in which your name is being glorified in the events that we've experienced this past week. Lord, I thank you so much for this food. Thank you for all those that have provided it. Thank you for the Fun and Fellowship Committee and for their leading in this way. And Lord, we thank you for just the way in which you provide for us food on a daily basis. And in your name I pray. Amen. Before I dismiss you, just the only direction I have is we will be meeting in the multi-purpose room for just this time of fellowship with these berry desserts, and you all are invited. Certainly didn't need to bring anything, so love to have you all join us in the multi-purpose room right as we dismiss. So thank you so much for joining us, and you are dismissed.